Your body gave out hours ago, but your brain decided that 2 a.m. was the right time to start a second shift. There's a reason for that, and it isn't weakness, or bad habits, or a broken sleep drive. Tonight, we follow the chemical that borrows from your rest to pay for your day. And why? For some brains, the debt comes due exactly when the lights go out. What you'll hear tonight isn't a sleep tip. It's the mechanism your brain has been running without your permission, and why fighting it has never worked. Welcome to Psychology for Sleep. If your brain has kept you awake in a body that was begging for rest, you're not broken. The system is doing exactly what it was wired to do. If you want to understand why, and find a place that doesn't ask anything of you tonight, subscribe, and come back whenever the midnight negotiation starts again. Before we go further, one breath together. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out whatever your brain was still trying to solve. Now, gently, into the deeper part. What follows isn't about fixing the night. It's about understanding the chemical that's been running it, and what your brain has actually been doing all this time while you thought it had no clear way to stop. You're in the quiet space where the debt your brain has been carrying is allowed to surface, without demand, without urgency. Let's begin there. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. That's the most common misread of what it does. What dopamine actually signals is anticipation, a neurochemical that fires not when you receive a reward, but when your brain predicts one is coming. This distinction, first clarified by neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz in the 1990s, changes everything we understand about why certain brains struggle to stop, to rest, or to let a task remain unfinished at the end of the day. Your brain isn't chasing happiness. It's chasing the moment just before. That distinction is worth sitting with. The wanting was never about the thing itself. In the ADHD brain, dopamine doesn't move the way it does elsewhere. Research from Mount Sinai has shown that people with ADHD have reduced dopamine transporter density, meaning dopamine is pulled back too quickly, leaving the brain chronically understimulated during low arousal states. A brain reading the environment as chronically insufficient does what any system does when it's running low: it searches harder, more broadly, with less ability to stop. This isn't personality. It's the output of a system responding rationally to its own shortage. The search wasn't impatience. The brain was doing the only thing it knew how to do with what it had. Here's something most people don't know about melatonin, the hormone that tells your body it's time to sleep. Its release is directly held back by dopamine activity in the brain. Specifically, dopamine acts on D1 and D2 receptors in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master clock, and blocks melatonin production in the pineal gland. When dopamine stays elevated in the evening, the clock never gets the signal to start the sleep cascade. The two systems are in conversation. When one is running loud, the other goes quiet. Something in the body knows that. The rest is just the conversation catching up. When the prefrontal cortex becomes dopamine depleted through a long day of high cognitive demand, it begins losing its hold on the limbic system. The limbic system, freed from its usual oversight, grows more reactive, more stimulus-seeking. more alert to perceived threat, more resistant to the soft signal that says it's time to close down for the night. This is how the second wind arrives, precisely when it's least useful. Not from new energy. From the collapse of the structure that was keeping the energy in check, the exhaustion was real. The second shift was the architecture's answer to it. Researchers call it dopamine debt, though most people know it as restlessness. When the brain has run high dopaminergic output all day, through urgency, novelty-seeking, or sustained focus, it enters the evening in a state of relative shortage. But shortage doesn't produce stillness. In the ADHD brain especially, it produces a drive to seek stimulation, the brain's attempt to self-medicate back to baseline. The phone becomes a dopamine drip. The spiral of thoughts becomes an internal search engine that won't shut down. The phone was never the problem. The phone was a response. The problem had been building since morning. Sleep deprivation creates a feedback loop that worsens the very shortage it was trying to recover from. A 2019 study in the Journal of Neuroscience found that even one night of poor sleep reduces dopamine receptor availability in the brain, specifically in the ventral striatum and thalamus, the regions that handle reward and arousal. The night your brain spent searching for stimulation instead of sleeping has, by morning, made the dopamine system less able to receive signal, setting up a slightly worse version of the same evening tomorrow. The loop had nothing to do with willpower. Chemistry was simply continuing what it had already begun. Your body has a repair window for the dopamine system, and it needs something specific to open. During slow-wave sleep, the brain's glymphatic network activates at a far higher rate than during waking hours, clearing byproducts tied to dopamine synthesis disruption. At the same time, dopaminergic neurons in the ventral tegmental area undergo restoration of receptor sensitivity. This window lasts roughly the first 90 minutes of uninterrupted sleep. Getting there isn't simply rest. It's scheduled maintenance. Running on a timetable the body set long before you chose a bedtime. The brain wasn't asking for a break. The maintenance is running now. The window is always the first 90 minutes of uninterrupted sleep. Light affects dopamine regulation in ways most people haven't considered. Retinal exposure to blue spectrum light, the kind most phones and screens produce, stimulates intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which feed directly into the suprachiasmatic nucleus and hold back melatonin. But screens also elevate retinal dopamine, a separate pathway housed in the eye itself, feeding into the broader arousal network. So screens aren't simply keeping people awake through interest or habit. They're delivering a low-grade chemical signal that the depleted evening brain was already looking to receive. The screen offered what the depleted network was already looking for. That's all. The timing of dopamine seeking at night follows a biological schedule, not a character flaw. Circadian research has shown that D2 receptor sensitivity follows a daily rhythm. A natural trough in early evening followed by a secondary rise in the late evening. For people with ADHD or dysregulated dopamine systems, this secondary rise arrives more strongly and lingers longer, producing what clinicians increasingly describe as a pattern resembling delayed sleep phase. Driven not by preference but by neurochemical arousal, the 2 a.m. second wind is a predictable event in a chemical calendar. The timing was never random. A predictable event on a predictable schedule. The clock was running the whole time. The prefrontal cortex doesn't just lose regulation at night. It begins misreading the body's own signals. Under dopamine shortage, the prefrontal cortex becomes less able to assess time accurately and less able to read the body's true fatigue level. This is why the ADHD brain, already running low by evening, tends to underestimate how tired it truly is. The brain isn't ignoring sleep signals. It's receiving them through a degraded translator. What reads as "I'm not that tired yet" is frequently "I can no longer accurately report how tired I am." The body knew. The translator was the one that had run out of words. There's a compound in the brain called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that works like fertilizer for the neural pathways dopamine depends on. BDNF supports the growth and upkeep of dopaminergic neurons, and its production is deeply tied to sleep quality. Research from the Karolinska Institute found that chronic sleep disruption reduces BDNF expression in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, the two regions most central to dopamine regulation and executive function. Less BDNF means weaker dopamine infrastructure. Weaker dopamine infrastructure produces less sleep. The loop feeds itself at the structural level. What looked like a sleep problem was a rebuilding problem too. And rebuilding needs the very thing the problem is stealing. The gut's relationship with dopamine is unexpected and worth knowing. Roughly half the body's dopamine is produced in the gut, by enterochromaffin cells lining the gastrointestinal tract. While gut dopamine doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier directly, it influences the enteric nervous system and feeds into the vagus nerve, which in turn shapes the autonomic system's readiness for rest. Research suggests that disruptions in gut microbiome composition may affect dopaminergic tone and sleep quality. Though the precise mechanisms in humans are still being mapped, the chemistry wasn't confined to the brain. The gut, the vagus nerve, the autonomic system, all part of the same exchange. The brain was never the only one talking. Cortisol and dopamine exist in a carefully calibrated relationship, and chronic stress tips that balance in a specific direction. Cortisol, the stress hormone that's meant to peak in the morning and taper through the day, activates the dopaminergic reward pathway in the nucleus accumbens. When it stays elevated into the evening, through unresolved urgency or ongoing strain, it keeps priming the dopamine system for action. The brain meant to power down is receiving a continuous signal that something still needs doing. The result isn't only wakefulness. It's a brain scanning the dark for a task it can complete. There was nothing to complete. The brain was running a search query from a problem that had already passed. Aerobic exercise is one of the few non-pharmacological tools that reliably resets the dopamine sleep cycle. It elevates dopamine synthesis in the striatum, raises D2 receptor density, and promotes BDNF release, all of which support more efficient dopamine recycling by the time evening arrives. A 2020 meta-analysis in the journal Sleep Medicine found that moderate aerobic exercise completed in the morning or early afternoon reduced sleep onset latency by an average of 17 minutes and increased slow wave sleep duration by roughly 14%. The chemistry of the night was being shaped in the morning. The body was preparing the night in the hours you were only thinking about the day. Novelty is one of the most reliable activators of the dopamine network. The nucleus accumbens fires particularly strongly in response to new stimuli, uncertain outcomes, and unexpected information, which is why a brief look at a social feed can hold the ADHD brain far beyond any intention to stop. Each scroll is a micro-lottery, a small new piece of information, a reward for investigation. The brain seeking dopamine at 2 a.m. is doing the rational thing. Following the most available source of the chemical it's running low on. That behavior made complete sense, given what the network needed and where it could find it. The behavior made complete sense. It was the logical choice. Dopamine and emotional memory are more tightly linked than most people realize. Dopaminergic activity in the amygdala during waking hours governs which emotional memories get tagged for consolidation during sleep. When dopamine is dysregulated across the day, too high in stimulating environments, too low in quiet ones, the tagging becomes inconsistent. Memories with high emotional weight but no resolution, unfinished conversations, open worries, get flagged for overnight processing. The brain reviewing the day's unresolved emotional material isn't refusing to let go. It's following a biological protocol for clearing accounts. The files were real. The review was necessary. The brain was doing exactly the work it was built to do. Dopamine is built from the amino acid tyrosine, which has to come from dietary protein. The conversion pathway, tyrosine to L, dopa to dopamine, requires cofactors including iron, folate, and vitamins B6 and B12. Evening meals high in refined carbohydrates and low in protein provide none of the raw material the brain needs for overnight dopamine system repair. Research into ADHD nutrition has found associations between dietary tyrosine intake and dopaminergic function, suggesting that what is eaten across the day shapes the brain's chemical capacity well into the night. The body needed something from the day that the day almost never gave it. The ADHD brain's relationship with time is inseparable from its relationship with dopamine. Temporal processing, the ability to accurately feel time passing, depends on dopaminergic signaling in the basal ganglia, specifically in the striatum. Low dopamine availability produces time blindness, the subjective compression of hours that makes a span of 90 minutes feel like 20. This is why people with ADHD describe looking up to discover it's suddenly 3 a.m. Not because they chose to stay awake, but because the brain's internal clock was running on inadequate fuel. The hours weren't lost. They went uncounted. The system ran out of what it needed to track them. There's a specific neurotransmitter that bridges dopaminergic arousal and sleep. And it isn't melatonin. Adenosine, a byproduct of cellular energy use, accumulates in the brain across the waking day and binds to receptors in the basal forebrain, building sleep pressure hour by hour. Caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors, which is why it delays sleep. But in the ADHD brain, elevated dopamine activity also modulates adenosine signaling, specifically by reducing the sensitivity of adenosine A, 2A receptors. the very receptors that generate the sensation of tiredness. The dopamine-elevated brain doesn't feel tired, not because it isn't. It feels tiredness less. The signal had been quietly rerouted around the part of the brain designed to receive it. Dopamine dysregulation disrupts the default mode network in ways that directly disturb sleep. This network, the constellation of regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and hippocampus, activates during rest, self-reflection, and mind-wandering. In neurotypical brains, the shift from task-positive activity to default mode is dopamine-gated as dopamine settles. The network activates smoothly, supporting the mental unwinding that precedes sleep. In ADHD and dopamine-dysregulated brains, this transition is erratic, producing a mind that won't stop narrating, revisiting, or generating, even when the body has clearly signaled it is done. The narration wasn't anxiety. The narrating mind was the resting network coming online without the usual gradual permission. A door opening too fast. Microglia, the brain's resident immune cells, manage synaptic pruning and neuroinflammation. Sleep deprivation activates them into a state of heightened readiness, and chronic sleep disruption has been shown to produce low-grade neuroinflammation in the prefrontal cortex and striatum, two regions central to dopamine regulation. Neuroinflammation in these areas reduces the efficiency of dopamine synthesis and receptor signaling, creating a feedback loop in which poor sleep produces the very neurochemical conditions that make sleep harder to reach. The longer disruption continues, the more thoroughly the system undermines its own recovery. The inflammation was the accumulation speaking, every night leaving something behind in the cells that held the day. It isn't reward receipt that keeps the wakeful brain running at night. It's reward anticipation. Neuroimaging studies using fMRI have consistently shown that dopaminergic circuits activated by anticipated rewards produce stronger and longer-lasting responses than those activated by rewards actually received. This is the neurological basis for lying in bed, thinking about tomorrow, rehearsing a conversation, planning something with no actual urgency. The brain isn't reviewing the past. It's pre-experiencing a future it cannot yet access. And the anticipatory loop keeps it engaged until the scenario plays out fully. The planning wasn't preparation. The anticipation circuit doesn't distinguish between accessible futures and unreachable ones. It just runs the simulation. That pattern, the brain cycling through future simulations it can never complete, turns out to be predictable on a biological calendar. Research from the Netherlands Institute for Neuroscience found that 60% of adults with ADHD meet criteria for delayed sleep phase disorder, a circadian condition in which sleep timing shifts 2 to 4 hours later than the social norm. This shift is driven partly by reduced sensitivity of the circadian clock to light cues, and partly by the dopaminergic delay in melatonin suppression described earlier. The night owl pattern in ADHD isn't a preference or a choice. It's the body's clock on a schedule the world it was born into never expected. The timing wasn't defiance. It was biology, navigating a world built for a different clock. The anterior cingulate cortex, which mediates conflict monitoring and emotional regulation, relies on dopamine to reduce the intensity of emotional responses. When dopamine is low, as it typically is by late evening, that regulatory capacity drops. This is why minor irritations feel enormous at 11 p.m. Why a small worry becomes catastrophic thinking at midnight. And why the emotional review of the day intensifies rather than quiets as sleep should be approaching. The emotional amplification wasn't disproportionate. It was the regulation system running out of fuel at the end of its shift. Feel that for a moment. The feelings were accurate. What ran out wasn't the emotion. It was what regulates the volume. At its core, the negotiation between dopamine and sleep is a negotiation about safety. The dopaminergic arousal system evolved in an environment where nighttime stillness was genuinely hazardous, where the brain needed to remain partially vigilant, scanning, responsive. The ADHD nervous system, which already runs a heightened threat detection protocol, is even less willing to stand down without a clear signal that the environment is secure. What sleep researchers call hyperarousal at sleep onset is, from an evolutionary view, the brain asking a reasonable question: is this safe? And receiving an insufficient answer. Modern life provides almost no neurochemical answer to that question. The brain wasn't being difficult. It was waiting for permission that the world had forgotten to give. What this first stretch has been tracing, step by step, is not a sleep problem. It is a chemistry problem with a sleep consequence. The network that governs wakefulness in the ADHD brain was not built for the world it inhabits. It was built for a world that no longer exists. One that required perpetual scanning, perpetual readiness, perpetual negotiation with the dark. The thing you've likely been calling insomnia, or a bad habit, or a failure of willpower, has a name that goes much deeper than any of those. It is a brain asking, at the end of every day, for something the day almost never provided. Feel where in your body that lands. What comes next follows the negotiation itself, the specific exchanges your brain makes in the hours it was meant to be resting, and why some of those exchanges have been quietly shaping the morning before it ever begins. Sleep isn't passive. During sleep, the brain conducts active chemical repair that directly shapes the next day's dopaminergic capacity. Specifically, during non-REM slow-wave sleep, the brain undertakes synaptic homeostasis, the systematic downscaling of synaptic strength accumulated across the waking day. This process, theorized by Giulio Tononi and Chiara Cirelli, preserves the most essential neural connections while clearing noise. In the dopaminergic network, this overnight recalibration restores the signal-to-noise ratio that determines how cleanly dopamine is read the following day. The brain that gets this sleep doesn't only feel better, it hears itself more clearly. The quiet of the night wasn't absence. During those hours, the circuitry sorts the day, keeps what mattered, releases what didn't. The quiet was the sorting, body doubling. The phenomenon where a ADHD focus improves in the presence of another person has a dopamine mechanism. The presence of another person activates the social dopamine pathway, releasing dopamine in the caudate nucleus and providing the external arousal the understimulated ADHD brain is otherwise searching for internally. This is also why some people with ADHD fall asleep more easily with background audio, a voice, a podcast, than in silence. The brain isn't being stimulated by the content. It's receiving just enough social context dopamine to stop looking for more. The brain found a quieter version of what it needed. That counts. The way the brain consolidates identity, the stories it tells about who you are, is dopamine dependent and happens primarily during sleep. The hippocampus, which moves experiences from short-term to long-term memory during sleep, prioritizes dopamine-tagged events coded as significant or emotionally resonant. The version of yourself that wakes each morning has been partly assembled overnight from the events the dopamine network found meaningful. A brain chronically deprived of slow-wave sleep assembles that story from incomplete material, and the self it produces tends toward effort and dysregulation, those tagged strongest during the depleted day. The story the morning told wasn't the whole story. The sleep could only assemble what it was given. Better material makes a more complete story. Magnesium, specifically magnesium glycinate, has a direct role in the dopamine sleep pathway. It acts as a natural antagonist to NMDA receptors, reducing the excitatory signaling that keeps the nervous system in a heightened state. It also supports the conversion of tryptophan to serotonin to melatonin, the chemical cascade the sleeping brain requires. Research has found associations between magnesium supplementation and reduced sleep onset latency, with particular benefit in people who also show signs of dopaminergic dysregulation. The mineral wasn't just a supplement. It was the missing piece of a conversation the body had been trying to finish. Poor sleep worsens ADHD, executive dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, impulsivity, and time blindness all intensify under sleep deprivation. Worsened ADHD produces behaviors that worsen sleep. Increased stimulation-seeking, greater difficulty with bedtime routines, heightened emotional reactivity at night. This cycle was formally described by researchers at Brown University, who found that roughly 75% of children with ADHD also met criteria for a clinically significant sleep disorder, and that treating the sleep disorder produced measurable reductions in ADHD symptoms without any change in medication. The two problems were never separate. They had always been the same problem wearing two different faces. What's sometimes called hyperfocus in the popular literature, attentional capture in the scientific one, is driven by a dopamine surge in the caudate nucleus that locks attention onto a task providing sufficient reward. The ADHD brain, which struggles to generate adequate dopamine at baseline, holds onto sources of it with unusual tenacity when it finds them. The brain that can't focus in a meeting will find itself unable to stop reading at 1 a.m. Not because it chose to prioritize the book, but because the dopamine is finally adequate and the network cannot voluntarily withdraw. Not stubbornness. The circuitry finally full and unwilling to return to empty. Acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter that modulates both REM sleep and attention, intersects with the dopamine network in complex ways. The cholinergic system governs REM sleep, generating acetylcholine bursts that characterize dreaming and emotional memory processing. Dopamine modulates this activity, particularly in the basal forebrain where cholinergic neurons govern arousal transitions. When dopamine is dysregulated, transitions into and out of REM become erratic. This is why ADHD is associated with abnormal REM distribution, often more in the first half of the night, less in the second, and why a ADHD sleep tends toward vivid, emotionally intense dreams. The vivid dreams weren't disturbance. They were the brain running its most emotionally honest archive. Neurologist William Dodson has described the ADHD nervous system as regulated not by importance, deadlines, or logical priority, but by the degree to which something generates sufficient neurochemical interest. This isn't a choice or a motivational failure. It reflects the actual architecture of a dopamine system that cannot sustain engagement without ongoing chemical reward. Sleep offers no interest. It offers the one thing the ADHD brain has the greatest difficulty valuing: stillness without output. The resistance to sleep was never about sleep itself. Sleep asks for release. The ADHD brain asks release into what? Exactly. That question has no neurochemical answer at baseline. Both IL-6 and TNF-alpha, produced by activated microglia during inflammatory states, inhibits tyrosine hydroxylase, the rate-limiting enzyme in dopamine production. A sleep-deprived brain isn't just a tired brain. It's a chemically inflamed brain producing less dopamine than it would have with adequate rest, entering the following day with both higher inflammatory load and reduced dopaminergic capacity. Each poor night deposits a small deficit against the following day's chemical budget. The deficit was accumulated. It didn't arrive with today. It had been building quietly, night by night, for some time before this one. The amygdala, which governs threat detection and emotional memory encoding, normally operates under regulatory influence from the prefrontal cortex. That regulation is dopamine mediated. As dopamine depletes across the day, that regulatory capacity drops, and the amygdala becomes more reactive. By late evening, the brain is more likely to read ambiguous signals, a vague worry, an uncertain future event, a half-remembered conversation, as genuinely threatening. The result is a nervous system primed to treat the quiet of the bedroom as a surveillance problem rather than a rest invitation. The worry wasn't weakness. It was the sentinel doing what sentinels do when the lights go out and no one has told them the night is safe. Tyrosine, the amino acid the brain converts into dopamine, competes with other large neutral amino acids for transport across the blood-brain barrier. Meals high in refined carbohydrates and low in tyrosine, a common evening pattern, reduce the brain's dopamine synthesis capacity for the hours that follow. Conversely, meals with adequate tyrosine and cofactors consumed in the late afternoon support more stable dopamine availability through the night, reducing the evening shortage that drives stimulation-seeking. The night was shaped by something that happened long before the night arrived. Earlier in the day, a different choice was already being made. Transitions asked the brain to release one context and orient to another. This process, task switching in the cognitive science literature, is dopamine expensive. The brain needs to release the current context, hold the gap, and orient to the new one. For the dopamine-depleted ADHD brain, this gap is where the network stalls. The current context is released, but orientation to sleep, which offers no dopaminergic reward, cannot proceed. The gap becomes a void the brain fills with thought, memory, planning, or any stimulus that gives it chemical traction, not resistance. The circuitry needing a bridge it didn't have the chemistry to build. The dopaminergic network is sensitive to prediction error, the gap between expectation and outcome, negative prediction errors, events worse than anticipated, produce a drop in dopamine signaling that the brain registers as unresolved business. The review of regrets at night is partly the dopamine network revisiting these events, running alternative versions, searching for a past that closes the prediction gap and restores baseline. The replay isn't self-punishment. It's an optimization process that cannot find a resting point and cannot stop running. What if the review wasn't punishment at all? What if it was the network doing the only thing it knew? Running the calculation one more time, looking for the version that closed the gap. A 2002 study by Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School found that long-term meditators showed increased cortical thickness in the insular and prefrontal cortex, regions governing interoception and dopamine regulation. Subsequent research has found associations between mindfulness practice and increased reward circuit activation during meditation, giving the brain a source of positive neurochemical signal that isn't tied to external stimulation or task completion. The ADHD brain, which struggles to find adequate reward without external input, can, with practice, learn to generate that signal from the act of attention itself. The stillness wasn't empty. For the trained brain, it was one of the richest sources available. Revenge, bedtime procrastination, a term popularized by Dutch researcher Floor Crozy, describes the tendency to stay up late in enjoyable activities as compensation for a day that felt controlled or overscheduled. In neurochemical terms, this is the depleted dopamine network seeking the self-directed reward the day's demands precluded. The brain isn't being childish. It's seeking restoration of the dopaminergic autonomy the day, with its schedules, obligations, and constant context switching. Systematically withdrew. The late night isn't wasted time. It's the network claiming the compensation it calculates it's owed. The staying up was never defiance. It was the brain finally being allowed to want something for itself. Acute stress activates the dopaminergic system. Short-term. Cortisol and catecholamine release produces a burst of dopaminergic arousal that supports vigilance and problem-solving. But chronic stress, sustained over weeks or months, depletes dopamine stores, downregulates D2 receptor density in the prefrontal cortex, and reduces BDNF expression in the hippocampus. A brain under chronic stress isn't only tired, it has been running its dopamine reserves faster than replenishing them. And the evening shortage reflects that accumulated withdrawal more than anything specific about the individual night. Feel how that lands. The exhaustion wasn't about today. The months before had been writing it into the body. And tonight the body finally showed the balance. The social dopamine pathway, distinct from the reward dopamine pathway, activates in response to connection, recognition, and mutual understanding. Oxytocin, released during social bonding, potentiates dopaminergic signaling in the nucleus accumbens and reduces cortisol, effectively lowering the arousal threshold the evening brain needs to cross before sleep can begin. This is one reason meaningful conversation before sleep, rather than information consumption, tends to produce easier sleep onset. The brain that feels genuinely heard has less scanning to do. The conversation wasn't a delay. The arousal that had been searching since morning found, in that conversation, something close to what it was looking for. A single bout of aerobic exercise lasting 20 minutes produces measurable increases in striatal dopamine through two routes: direct synthesis from physical activity-induced catecholamine release, and increased expression of the dopamine transporter, improving recycling at the synapse. Morning exercise has been shown to improve sleep onset time by 30 to 60 minutes in people with delayed sleep phase patterns. A finding attributed specifically to dopamine-mediated normalization of the circadian arousal threshold. The morning run wasn't about the morning. That's the leverage point. The morning run was writing the chemistry of the night hours before the night arrived. The brain's experience of boredom isn't the absence of dopamine. It's the presence of unmet dopamine expectation. Boredom, studied by neuroscientist Sandy Mann at the University of Central Lancashire, is associated with elevated default mode activity combined with dopaminergic frustration. A network predicting reward should be available, but unable to locate it. The ADHD brain, with its lower dopaminergic baseline and higher sensitivity to reward expectation, experiences boredom not as mild discomfort, but as a pressing, driven state the network is wired to resolve. The restlessness of the ADHD bedtime isn't ordinary boredom. It is the brain's most insistent distress signal wearing the quietest possible disguise. The hypothalamus coordinates both temperature regulation and the onset of sleep. Dopamine receptors there influence the timing and rate of core temperature decline. The drop of roughly 1 to 2 degrees Celsius that signals the body's readiness for deep sleep. In people with dopamine dysregulation, this temperature drop is often delayed or attenuated, meaning the body arrives at bedtime without having completed the thermal preparation sleep requires. A cooler room accelerates this process. The environmental temperature providing the trigger, the internal dopamine signal is too depleted to deliver. The cool wasn't comfort. It was the body being given the signal it had stopped producing for itself. Recent research from MIT's McGovern Institute has shown that the cerebellum contains dopaminergic neurons that project to the ventral tegmental area, one of the brain's primary dopamine production centers. These cerebellar VTA projections modulate the timing and magnitude of dopamine release in ways that influence both reward processing and circadian arousal. ADHD is increasingly understood to involve cerebellar as well as prefrontal dysfunction, which may explain some of the variability in how dopamine-related sleep disruption presents across individuals. The architecture was more layered than the name ever suggested. Every structure was part of the same conversation. Social jet lag, a term coined by chronobiologist Till Roenberg, describes the misalignment between the body's natural circadian timing and the social schedule imposed by school, work, and cultural norms. For most people, this misalignment averages roughly 1 hour. For those with ADHD and delayed sleep phase, it can average 2 to 4 hours, meaning the ADHD brain is asked to perform at peak capacity at a time neurobiologically equivalent to the middle of the night for its internal clock. The consequences include heightened dopamine depletion by afternoon and a compounded inability to sleep at a socially conventional hour. Not an inability to function. A person running a marathon that started at midnight. The afternoon dopamine trough, observed in both neurotypical and ADHD individuals, but more pronounced in the latter, corresponds to a natural dip in catecholamine production following the morning cortisol peak. In ADHD, this trough is deeper and longer, producing a period of markedly reduced executive function, motivation, and emotional regulation that typically runs from early to mid-afternoon. The crash is the brain's acknowledgement that it has borrowed heavily from a supply not yet replenished, and that the replenishment schedule was never designed for what the morning demanded. The crash was the ledger being read aloud, right on schedule, accurate to the penny. Research from the Karolinska Institute found that white noise exposure during cognitive tasks improved performance in children with ADHD at levels comparable to low-dose stimulant medication. The proposed mechanism is stochastic resonance. Background noise raises the signal-to-noise ratio of dopaminergic input, just enough to bring the understimulated network to a more functional arousal state. Applied to sleep. Pink noise has been shown to enhance slow-wave sleep by entraining neural oscillations in the cortex. It provides rhythmic, non-information-bearing stimulation that keeps the ADHD arousal network sufficiently occupied to allow the sleep process to proceed. The noise wasn't distraction. Enough. Not silence. Not stimulation. Just enough input to stop the search. That's all the pink noise provided. Researchers studying hyperarousal in ADHD have identified a single underlying dynamic the brain requires: the signal that the environment is safe, that the self is adequate, and that nothing critical remains unresolved, before it will consent to the vulnerability of unconsciousness, the output of a threat-sensitive network running on insufficient dopamine all day, reading every ambiguous signal as potential threat. The negotiation that begins every night is the brain's attempt to collect enough evidence of safety to justify standing down. Most nights, that evidence is never fully assembled. The brain wasn't refusing sleep. It was asking a question the night never quite managed to answer. What keeps surfacing across all of this is a brain that isn't failing at sleep. It is succeeding, with considerable precision, at something else entirely, monitoring an environment it cannot trust. Running a biological negotiation it was never given enough to win, and doing all of this on borrowed reserves that were already running low before the day began. If you have spent years wondering what is wrong with your sleep, the answer emerging across this hour is not what is wrong. It is what has been asked of a network that was never built for the asking. Feel where in your body that lands. What the second half follows is the darker part of the negotiation. The price the brain pays across months and years when the evidence of safety never comes. And what changes when it finally does. The prefrontal cortex and the dopamine network co-develop throughout childhood and adolescence. The PFC is the last brain region to fully mature, reaching full myelination around age 25. In ADHD, this maturation is delayed by roughly 3 to 5 years, meaning the regulatory relationship between dopamine and executive function catches up, but later than the world expects. The ADHD teenager who struggles to sleep is not lacking willpower. They hold a prefrontal cortex running years behind its own schedule. The delay was never inadequacy. It was a different arrival time at the same destination. During wakefulness, the thalamus actively relays sensory information to the cortex. During sleep onset, thalamic neurons shift from tonic to burst firing, closing the gate on incoming sensory input and allowing the cortex to disconnect from the external environment. Dopamine modulates this gating transition. D2 receptors in the reticular nucleus govern how readily the gate closes. When dopamine is dysregulated, the gate is slow to close or closes incompletely, producing the experience of being almost asleep but still aware of sounds, thoughts, and sensations that should have been filtered out. The gate was trying. The instructions it had were not enough for the work being asked of it. A 2014 study in the journal Sleep found that people with chronic insufficient sleep showed reduced gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, two regions central to dopamine regulation and executive function. These structural changes were partially reversible with extended recovery sleep, but not fully, suggesting that years of dopamine-disrupted nights leave a measurable imprint on the brain's architecture. The exhaustion visible in the ADHD adult is not only the current night, it is the accumulated structural residue of every previous night. What looked like fatigue was also a map of everything the nights had cost. The vagus nerve carries most of its signals from the gut to the brain rather than the reverse, providing continuous updates on the body's state. Gut bacteria influence this communication through the production of short-chain fatty acids and neurotransmitter precursors. Research using germ-free animal models has shown that the absence of gut microbiome significantly alters dopaminergic motor behavior, suggesting that the microbiome participates in setting the baseline tone of the dopaminergic network. Though the precise mechanisms in humans are still under investigation, the gut wasn't separate from the brain. Every hour of the night, the gut was communicating, not loudly, just steadily, through the vagus nerve, toward the brain. Sleep inertia reflects the brain's transition from sleep to wakefulness, during which prefrontal function is temporarily suppressed while the dopaminergic arousal network comes back online. In neurotypical individuals, this takes 5 to 20 minutes. In ADHD, where dopamine transporter function is already less efficient, the arousal network takes longer to reach operational levels, producing the experience of being technically awake but functionally incapacitated for 30 minutes to several hours. The difficulty getting out of bed is not a character issue. It is the dopamine network finding its footing on an uneven surface. The morning wasn't failure. It was the engine running its startup sequence on a cold day. Research led by Robert Zatorre at McGill University found that music producing the emotional chill response reliably activates the nucleus accumbens and releases dopamine at the moment of peak response. More broadly, familiar music of moderate tempo reduces cortisol and facilitates the transition into the parasympathetic state required for sleep onset. The ADHD brain seeking dopamine at bedtime may find in familiar music a substitute for stimulation-seeking that otherwise extends the wakeful period, giving the arousal network enough to allow the arousal network to settle. The music wasn't a distraction from sleep. Before the network could settle, it needed one more thing. Familiar music was that thing. Small. Sufficient. Research on cognitive fatigue has shown that sustained, moderately engaging tasks, requiring attention but not stress, produce a post-task dopaminergic rebound, followed by elevated adenosine sleep pressure. Reading narrative fiction fits this profile. It engages the default mode network in a reward-positive way, producing cognitive fatigue that accelerates natural sleep pressure without triggering the stress-arousal response that keeps the ADHD brain awake. The brain that cannot stop scrolling might find, in a sufficiently engaging book, the same chemical reward at a pace the sleep network can absorb. The book wasn't avoidance. It was the right speed of stimulus for a brain that needed one last thing before rest. Stimulant medications, methylphenidate and amphetamine salts, work by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine availability in the synapse, addressing the shortage that drives daytime dysfunction. When taken too late, they can extend dopaminergic arousal into the evening and delay sleep. But research has found that when timed correctly, stimulant treatment in ADHD can improve sleep quality over the medium term by reducing the daytime depletion that drives evening stimulation-seeking, and by allowing the prefrontal cortex to complete its regulatory work before evening begins. The medication wasn't always the enemy of sleep. In some bodies, it was the thing that finally let the evening negotiate on even terms. DHA is the primary structural component of neuronal membranes and critical to the fluidity of those membranes, which directly affects the efficiency of receptor signaling. Dopamine D2 receptors embedded in DHA-deficient membranes show reduced sensitivity, meaning the same amount of dopamine produces less effect. Research from Oxford University found that children with higher omega-3 levels showed better sleep quality, fewer nighttime awakenings, and longer sleep duration than those with lower levels. The mechanism operated through improved dopaminergic signal transduction. The chemistry of the night was also the chemistry of the membrane. What was eaten across the weeks had been building the walls of every night since. Repeated negative prediction errors. Outcomes worse than expected, including ongoing social censure or failure to meet standards. Progressively reduce dopaminergic activity in the prefrontal cortex. Over time, the network stops expecting replenishment. The person who struggles to feel motivated or to feel rewarded by completion is not experiencing a character deficit. They are experiencing the neurochemical consequence of a history in which the prediction gap has been running negative for too long. What looked like giving up was the network making the only calculation available to it. The difficulty was never about wanting. It was about a network told, too many times, not to expect very much. Genuine laughter is among the most potent natural activators of the mesolimbic reward pathway. Research by Robert Provine at the University of Maryland found that the anticipation of laughter alone elevates endorphin release and activates reward circuitry in ways that measurably shift emotional state. For the ADHD brain seeking restoration in the evening, shared laughter with a trusted person is not merely pleasant. It is one of the most efficient mood and arousal modulation tools available, requiring no equipment, no skill, only a companion and a reason. The laughter wasn't a luxury. It was the most ancient medicine the reward network has ever known. The hypnagogic state, the transitional consciousness between waking and sleeping, involves simultaneous default mode network activity and deactivation of the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine, which normally gates mental imagery through prefrontal inhibition, loses that gating function as the PFC powers down. The images that emerge, faces, landscapes, geometric patterns, fragments of memory, are the unfiltered output of the visual cortex briefly, without its dopaminergic supervisor. They aren't hallucinations in the clinical sense. They are the brain's imagery generation running briefly unchaperoned. The faces at the edge of sleep weren't intrusion. They were the mind's own gallery, left unlocked. Research using neuroimaging has shown that story comprehension activates the default mode network, the hippocampus, and the nucleus accumbens simultaneously. A convergence associated with reward processing and memory consolidation. The brain telling itself a story is organizing emotionally unresolved material into a sequential structure the dopamine network can evaluate and close. This is partly why narrative-rich content before sleep tends to facilitate sleep onset, and partly why the brain's own storytelling about the day continues after lights are out until the narrative finds its resting point. The internal storytelling wasn't avoidance. It was the only work the brain knew how to finish before sleep. Pro-inflammatory cytokines, including IL-1 beta and TNF-alpha, bind to receptors in the basal ganglia and reduce dopaminergic activity, producing the motivational symptoms of sickness, behavior withdrawal, reduced interest, and a drive to remain still and horizontal. These aren't incidental side effects. They are adaptive, redirecting energy from dopamine-expensive activities toward the sleep and rest that immune recovery requires. The body was using the same dopaminergic pathway that makes the ADHD night hard as a tool for recovery when it needed it most. When the body demanded rest, that wasn't weakness. It was the wisest negotiation the chemistry knew how to make. Researchers documented a nadir in dopaminergic activity in the hours between 3 and 5 a.m., coinciding with the lowest point of core body temperature. This window corresponds clinically to when people with ADHD report the most intense cognitive distortions, the most catastrophic thinking, and the deepest sense of hopelessness. The 4 a.m. despair is not a psychological verdict. It is a biological trough, real, chemical, and temporary. Understanding this changes what the feeling means. Even when it doesn't make it smaller, the despair that arrives in the small hours was never the truth. It was the chemistry at its lowest point before the tide turned. Shame, the experience of the self as fundamentally inadequate, activates the same dopaminergic reward pathway as physical pain in the anterior insular and dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. Processing shame costs dopamine, compounding the evening shortage. Furthermore, shame about sleep. The thought I should be able to just fall asleep like everyone else initiates a cortisol spike that directly suppresses the melatonin production required for sleep onset. The shame about the problem was chemically worsening the problem. The self-criticism was the costliest thing in the room, more reliable than anything else at guaranteeing the night would not end. Research on cold water immersion has documented that brief exposure to cold temperatures produces a marked elevation in norepinephrine and dopamine. Among the more sustained dopamine increases, achievable without pharmacological intervention, the key feature appears to be voluntariness. Choosing the cold activates a reward circuit response that passive exposure does not. For the ADHD brain, seeking a morning dopamine foundation sufficient to reduce evening shortage, voluntary cold exposure may represent a practical, accessible tool. Though individual responses vary, and the research, while promising, continues to develop. The cold wasn't punishment. It was the first conversation the dopamine network would have with the day. Research has found that gratitude practice activates the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, regions that govern both dopamine regulation and sleep-wake transitions. The experience of recognizing something of value, which gratitude practice produces through deliberate recall, activates reward circuitry and shifts the nervous system away from threat monitoring. The evening gratitude practice isn't merely positive psychology. It's a low-cost neurochemical tool the prefrontal cortex can initiate voluntarily. Even late in the day when other dopamine sources have been exhausted, the thank you reaches somewhere in the chest. Let it. That's the network doing something kind for itself before the night begins. Worry is the cognitive expression of the brain's uncertainty minimization drive. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activates during worry and communicates with the amygdala in a loop that continues as long as uncertainty remains unresolved. Dopamine modulates how long this loop runs before terminating. In dopamine-depleted states, the termination signal is weak, and the loop continues cycling through the same scenarios without resolution. The brain isn't being irrational. It's applying the correct tool, future scenario simulation, to a problem that cannot be solved by simulation alone. The loop wasn't wrong. It was the most intelligent response available to a brain that could not make the future certain. During REM sleep, the motor cortex is active, generating movement impulses for running, speaking, or gesturing, while the ventral horn of the spinal cord is simultaneously inhibited, preventing those movements from being enacted. This rematonia, governed partly by dopaminergic regulation of the brainstem, is what prevents sleepers from acting out their dreams. In conditions of dopamine dysregulation, including REM sleep behavior disorder, more common in ADHD populations, this inhibition can fail, and the dreaming brain moves the body it thought it had left behind. The body in sleep was never fully absent from the dream. The two had only agreed to keep a respectful distance. The temporal precision of dopamine release is central to reinforcement learning. Dopamine released within milliseconds of a behavior signals reward. Dopamine released even slightly later fails to associate correctly with the preceding action. Sleep deprivation slows the processing speed of dopaminergic circuits, introducing delays that corrupt the credit assignment process. The sleep-deprived brain learns less accurately, reinforcing the wrong behaviors, failing to consolidate the right lessons. Entering the next day with a network that is subtly miscalibrated. What the tired brain couldn't learn wasn't for lack of trying. The signal was real. It was arriving slightly too late. And in reinforcement learning, slightly too late is the same as never. The olfactory bulb is the only sensory organ with direct projections to the limbic system. Bypassing the thalamic relay, all other sensory information passes through. Olfactory stimuli reach the amygdala, hippocampus, and reward circuitry without intermediary processing. Certain scents, particularly lavender, have shown in controlled studies a tendency to increase parasympathetic activity and improve sleep quality. Though precise neurochemical mechanisms remain under investigation, what the evidence suggests is that scent arrives through a more direct route than other senses. The scent wasn't simply comfort. It was a language that arrived directly at the part of the brain that decides whether the night is safe. Research has documented that ADHD time blindness extends into the nocturnal hours, with people reporting they genuinely cannot gauge how long they have been awake, losing an hour to what felt like minutes, or 5 minutes stretching into something far longer. The mechanism mirrors what happens during the day. Dopamine's role in temporal processing in the basal ganglia is compromised, removing the internal clock's ability to accurately meter duration. The night both disappears and extends, offering no reliable feedback about how long the vigil has actually lasted. The night was never as endless as it felt, or as brief as it vanished. The clock had simply stopped reporting. Tired but wired reflects the simultaneous presence of high adenosine sleep pressure, the accumulated drive for sleep that increases with every waking hour, and high dopaminergic arousal, suppressing the adenosine signal's access to the sleep initiation circuits. The body is generating maximum urgency for sleep. The dopamine network is generating maximum resistance to it. Both signals are genuine and simultaneous, producing the paradoxical state of someone desperate for sleep and constitutionally unable to achieve it. The exhaustion and the wakefulness were both real. The tragedy was that they arrived at the same address at the same time. What the research converges on is a single counterintuitive conclusion: the ADHD brain's resistance to sleep is not a failure of the sleep network. It is the output of a survival network running on inadequate resources, in an environment providing insufficient signals of safety. Asking a brain that cannot read its own fatigue to make a decision it was never given the right tools to make. Sleep doesn't come when forced. It comes when the negotiation between depletion and arousal, between threat and safety, reaches resolution. The sleep was never being withheld. It was waiting, every night, for conditions the brain had been trying to assemble. What all of this has been describing, slowly, is a brain that was never designed to simply decide to sleep. It was designed to stay awake, until it received enough chemical evidence that the night was safe. The self was sufficient, and the account was close enough to balance to justify the vulnerability of letting go. If you have spent years treating this as a willpower problem, what the research has been quietly doing across this hour is replacing that story with a more accurate one. Not easier, but more accurate. And a more accurate story is the only kind that has ever given the brain permission to stop running. Feel where in your body that lands. What the final facts carry is different. They don't explain anymore. They only confirm what is already beginning to release. The melatonin that the pineal gland was holding back while the dopamine negotiation ran, it is beginning, now, to be released. Not because you did anything to initiate it, because the conditions blocking it are easing. The chemistry of sleep is not something you do. It is something that happens in the absence of what was preventing it. The body has always known how to do this. It was waiting for the negotiation to find its terms. Those terms are being found now, quietly, without effort on your part. The prefrontal cortex, which has been regulating and monitoring and translating all day, mediating between impulse and action, between emotion and response, is beginning to reduce its metabolic rate. The executive is stepping back from the desk, not because the work is done, because the work has reached the hour when continuing costs more than it returns. This isn't failure. It is the network doing what it was always designed to do at the end of a long day. The stepping back has already begun. The glymphatic network, the brain's clearance system, largely inactive during waking hours, activates during deep sleep at a dramatically higher rate than during the day. What accumulates across the waking hours, the metabolic residue of thought, the chemical byproducts of sustained attention and emotional processing, all of it begins clearing in the hours ahead. The biology of the brain is already anticipating what is coming. The repair has been scheduled since before you lay down. It is waiting for you to arrive. This particular conversation between arousal and safety was never going to be ended by force. Every act of trying, the counting, the clock watching, the demand made of the mind to stop, fed the arousal network the very engagement it was seeking. The only resolution the negotiation has ever accepted is enough safety, enough depletion, and enough time. Two of those three have been building for hours. The third has been present all along, quieter than the vigilance drowning it out, but present. It is quieter still now. The amygdala, which has been cataloging ambiguity and flagging uncertainty since morning, running its threat detection protocol through every interaction of the day, is receiving reduced input from the arousal network. The sentinel is noticing that the night has offered nothing that requires a response. The scanning is slowing. The threshold for what registers as threatening is quietly rising. What demanded a response an hour ago now only requires acknowledgement. The watch isn't ending. It's loosening its grip, 1 degree at a time. The thalamic gate, that gateway between the outside world and the sleeping cortex, is beginning to close. Sounds that reached you fully a moment ago are now arriving more softly, passing through a filter, gradually thickening between the world and your awareness of it. This is the architecture doing what it was always designed to do when the conditions were finally right. It doesn't need your help. It doesn't need your permission. It is already closing, slowly, at the pace the biology intended. The body temperature has been declining for the last hour, a drop of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius that the body initiates on its own, without instruction or effort. This is a change happening entirely without your involvement. The thermal preparation is proceeding on its own terms, in the direction it was always going to go once the arousal network stopped interfering. The body has been moving toward this moment since late afternoon. It has been waiting for the brain to arrive. The adenosine that has been accumulating in the basal forebrain since you woke this morning, that chemical pressure representing every consecutive hour of wakefulness, has been building toward this. The signal it carries, that the biological debt of the day is ready to be repaid, is now strong enough to compete with the arousal network on nearly equal terms. The network knows what this pressure means. It has always known. It is beginning now to listen. The default mode network is shifting from narrative generation to something quieter. The story of the day, its unresolved scenes, its open questions, is losing the urgency it held since morning. The brain is beginning to release its grip on the events it has been processing, not because they are resolved, but because the fuel making them feel pressing is depleting. The narration is slowing. The space between thoughts is growing. Something quieter is moving in to fill it. The BDNF that the night will produce, the compound that supports and rebuilds the dopaminergic pathways that tomorrow's focus and regulation depend on, is waiting for slow-wave sleep to begin its synthesis. This repair is available only in these hours, in the specific conditions that deep sleep creates. The repair tomorrow needs is already scheduled. The body has set aside the resources. Everything that needs to happen tonight is already in motion. It only requires that sleep begin. The heart rate has been declining slowly for the last several minutes. The autonomic nervous system is shifting toward parasympathetic dominance. The rest state the body enters when it has determined the environment is safe enough to lower its guard. This is the body's oldest signal to itself that the long work of the day is done. Not that everything is resolved, only that the long work is done. The body has been waiting to send this signal. It is sending it now. Every breath is slightly slower than the one before. Not because you are controlling it, because the network that runs the breath is following the same cascade running everywhere else in the body right now. Moving, without assistance, without effort, without any decision on your part, toward rest. The body has been waiting to do this. The only thing it needed was for the part of the brain that kept interrupting to finally run low enough on fuel to stop. The dopamine shortage that accumulated across the day, the depletion that made the evening restless, that made the phone irresistible, that made the dark feel like something requiring navigation, is going to be partially repaid in the hours ahead. The overnight repair window addresses what it can. The account that felt so depleted at 9 p.m. is already receiving its first deposit. The brain that wakes tomorrow will begin a little more whole than the brain that lay down tonight. The muscles of the jaw, the back of the neck, the shoulders that held the day. They are releasing tension in increments so small they were not noticeable until the release itself makes the holding visible. Some of it has already left. The jaw that was clenched without awareness has loosened. The shoulders that rose somewhere in the middle of the afternoon have begun their slow return. More is leaving now. As the body processes that the holding was provisional and the thing being held against has passed, the part of the brain that tracks unfinished business, that generates the loop of things still to do, is losing metabolic priority. The loop is still there. The list is still there. But the fuel that was making them feel pressing is depleting. The things that felt pressing an hour ago now feel distant, not because the business is finished, because the brain has made the only decision available at this hour that the business can wait until morning. The ventral tegmental area, the brain's primary dopamine production center, is preparing to shift from its waking mode into sleep state activity. The dopaminergic oscillations of sleep are different, slower, more rhythmic, organized around consolidation of the day's learning and the emotional tagging of memory. The assembling of tomorrow's self is beginning. The version of you that will wake in the morning is being quietly prepared in the hours you are not watching. The breath continues. The temperature continues to fall. The adenosine continues accumulating, pressing steadily toward the threshold at which the sleep switch tips. Everything the body knows how to do in preparation for rest, it has been doing, quietly, without permission or instruction, all along. Not because you did anything right tonight, because the body was always going to do this. Given the conditions are here. What the ADHD brain needed from the night was not discipline, not willpower. It needed information. The information that the environment is safe. The information that the self is adequate as it is. The information that rest is available and nothing essential will be missed by taking it. That information is harder to manufacture than melatonin. It cannot be supplemented. It can only be arrived at, gradually, across many nights, through the slow accumulation of evidence that the negotiation is finding its way. That information is here now, in the slowing of the breath, in the quiet of the room, in the absence of anything that requires a response tonight. In this moment, in this hour, the arousal network, occupied elsewhere, was too loud to hear it before. It is quieter now, and in that quiet, the information the brain has been waiting for can finally be heard. The terms are being reached, not because anything was solved, not because the day's unresolved material was resolved, because the chemistry, the adenosine accumulating, the dopamine settling, the cortisol finally declining, the melatonin moving into the bloodstream, has found the conditions it needed to tip the balance. The brain did not decide to sleep. It arrived at the place where sleep was the only outcome left. The eyes, if not already closed, are finding it unnecessary to remain open. There is nothing here that requires watching. The only thing that has changed is the cost of maintaining vigilance. And that cost, quietly rising for the last several hours, has finally exceeded what the arousal network can still pay. The watching is ending, not because there is nothing to watch, because the part of the brain that was watching has run out of fuel to care. The mind, if it is still generating thoughts, is finding those thoughts less pressing than they were. They are arriving more slowly, departing more easily. The grip each thought had on the next is loosening. One thought arrives, sits, and instead of producing another, dissolves. The space between thoughts is growing. What is beginning to fill that space is not another thought. It is something closer to the absence of the need for one. The body that carried you through the day is being set down now. Not abandoned, set down. The way you set something down when you finally reach the place where holding it is no longer necessary. it has done what it was asked to do. Every hour of it. It is allowed to rest now. It has earned this. The night, which has resisted so many other nights, which held you at the edge of sleep and pulled you back, is not resisting now. The conditions are different. The chemistry is different. The negotiation, which ran so many previous nights without resolution, is finding its resolution. Nothing sudden, nothing that can be pointed to and named. Just the gradual, biological settling of a network that has been trying, for a long time, to arrive here. You did not fail to sleep on all those other nights. You held, through all of them, a network asking for more than it was given. And you held it as well as anyone could have. Tonight, the asking is quieter. The chemistry is closer to still. Whatever this night gives, an hour, or 3, or something longer, it is the network doing what it was always capable of. When the conditions were finally right. Rest well, weary mind. The debt is being repaid. There is something the research keeps arriving at. From every direction. From the dopamine architecture. From the circadian biology. From the inflammatory cascades and the glymphatic repair windows and the prediction error loops and the thalamic gating. And it is this. The brain that could not sleep was not broken. It was a precision instrument running a program that had never been explained to it, in an environment that had never been calibrated to receive it, on a chemical budget that the world had never agreed to replenish. What tonight was, in all its science, in all its accumulated understanding, was the budget, finally, being addressed, not solved, not permanently resolved, but addressed, in the only way a brain can address anything, by receiving enough information to change what it believes about the night. The negotiation your brain has been running, for years, perhaps, without knowing that was what it was, is not a character flaw. It is chemistry asking for conditions that chemistry needs. And the brain that understands that is the only brain that has ever been able to stop fighting the very network it needed to rest within. The ADHD Sleepy Facts playlist has been returning to this territory. The gap between what the brain was built for and what the world has been asking of it. The next video carries this further. That video is waiting whenever you are ready. The dopamine debt that has been running, through all the days and all the evenings and all the 2 a.m.s that came before this one, is being handed to the night now. Not resolved, handed over. Let your shoulders release the last of what they agreed to hold on behalf of the day. Sleep is where the work continues without you, in the circuits that recalibrate while you rest, in the glymphatic tide that clears what the waking hours accumulated, in the slow oscillations that are already beginning. If your eyes have already closed, there is nothing here they need to open for. Rest well, weary mind, tonight. The terms have been found. Some debts the brain was never meant to settle alone. Sleep is where it brings them, where the chemistry finally quiets and the night begins. Good night.